Alright, welcome everyone to episode 51 of the Drunken Boxing Podcast, coming to you directly, as always, from the capital of the Middle Kingdom, Beijing. Over here, we are finally moving into autumn. Beijing's autumn is fairly short, but it's a very pleasant period of the year because the summer is swelteringly hot, humid and sticky, and the winters are generally pretty cold, so this little period in between is great. Usually it's the best time in terms of weather for training, so I don't know what it's like where you are, but hopefully it's not too heavy and that you're having a good autumn. If you're in the southern hemisphere, well, you're moving into spring. Alright, let's move right into some Mushin martial culture news. I haven't released a lot of new items on the YouTube channel, simply because the one video that I did release, takes quite a long time to produce. And that is part 3 of The Last Master of a Generation, Li Ziming, which is part of the ongoing Legacy of Bagua Zhang series. This is a continuation on the previous 2 episodes of the interview and Bagua Museum tour given by Li Ziming's daughter, Li Xiuren. In this episode, we get into some more interesting details regarding Li Ziming's life and his work, particularly surrounding the establishment of the Beijing Bagua Zhang Research Association, which was the first single-style association established in China. Li Ziming was actually a pioneer in many regards, and this is one of the most important things that he did, because he set the standard and he set a pathway that was followed by numerous organizations thereafter. In China, it's quite a difficult thing to be the first person to do such a thing, specifically when you're talking about getting recognized. Nobody wants to recognize endeavors that have never been done before, because responsibility falls upon that person who recognized it, should anything go wrong. So it was quite a feat that Li Ziming managed to do. Not only that, he managed to unite all the Bagua Zhang families within Beijing for this endeavor, following his relocation of Dong Haichuan's tomb. Again, one of the most major and one groundbreaking pioneering action that Li Ziming did in his life. This episode goes into some detail about that. It also covers some aspects related to his personal life, some of the aspects relating to a tumultuous period in China, which was the Cultural Revolution. There's more on this to come in the next episode. And of course, Li Xiuren gives us a further tour of her Bagua Museum with some interesting items in it. The full series should end with the next episode, which is episode 4. As mentioned in the beginning, the interview and the tour lasted more than 2 hours, and I've tried to break it up into bite sizes, which are still pretty long, that are more digestible, as opposed to trying to put it all out in one long episode. So I'm hoping to wrap it up in the next episode, depending on how long the next episode will be, but I'm aiming for episode 4 to be the last one. If you haven't watched episodes 1 and 2, I highly recommend it. It's very informative, and in fact, most of the Legacy of Bagua Zhang content, I think for most Bagua Zhang practitioners, well, definitely for Bagua Zhang practitioners, but for most Chinese martial arts enthusiasts, it will be something interesting to watch. Additionally, my younger Kung Fu brother, Alexei Chagai, who lives out in Vladivostok, made a little video of him creating a traditional hand-carved seal, which he did for me as a gift. And he made a little video of his process and, in fact, the final stamp itself, just out of interest. So if you're interested in seeing this very interesting aspect of Chinese traditional culture, that is seal carving, go take a look at the little video. It's a short one, but it's quite interesting, and my heartfelt gratitude goes out to Alexei, who took the time to create such a wonderful piece for me. Alright, what's coming up? Well, there's quite a bit coming up. As mentioned, further episodes of the Li Xiuren interview will be coming up, but I have also filmed a somewhat tangential topic video, mostly focused on culture and history, and that is regarding the Baita Si, or the Miaoying Si, which is quite a famous temple here in Beijing with a very interesting history. It's one of my favorite places to visit. Dates from the Yuan dynasty. It was actually built by Kublai Khan himself and designed by a Nepalese architect who was working for the Yuan dynasty at the time, named Arniko. Now, Arniko is quite famous in terms of his architectural work for the Yuan dynasty, also his artistic work. He painted portraits of Kublai and his wife. The White Dagoba Temple which is quite famous, used to be the largest, well, rather the tallest structure in Dadu, which is what Beijing was called at that time. And it remained so for quite a long time afterwards. It was the tallest building here. It was considered a stupa, but it's called a dagoba because it's a larger type of a stupa. It was built to house, in general, the temple was built as a dedication to Mahakala. I will introduce who Mahakala is in relation to Tibetan Buddhism, which is what Kublai Khan practiced. And it's going to be quite an interesting little video for those of you that aren't able to or haven't visited the place. And hopefully it'll pique your interests to come out one day and visit it. For me, it's fascinating, the history surrounding it, the architecture, the thoughts when I'm sitting there of the people that had been there all those hundreds of years ago, standing exactly where I was standing. It just kind of connects you to history and makes it all that more interesting. That video will be coming out soon. As always, my Patreon supporters get early access to videos. So if you want to get an early glimpse when that is out, subscribe to Patreon. We have general support tiers that you can subscribe to, and you will get access to early released footage. So that is coming up. Additionally, Emanuele Papa, who's a Chinese wrestling enthusiast, a high-level practitioner hailing from Italy, who used to live in Beijing, and he's back now in Beijing following the pandemic. He's also a Mongolian Bok wrestler and a wrestling enthusiast of all kinds. He does Korean belt wrestling. He does other nomadic and other traditional forms of wrestling, including Greco. And we filmed a hidden history of Shuaijiao addendum video, which is going to be extremely exciting and interesting for anybody interested in this topic. It features an unseen interview with a very prominent practitioner who goes into details candidly about the true history of Shuaijiao, Chinese Shuaijiao, and how its history has been somewhat shrouded and where it actually comes from, which is what I covered in the Hidden History of Shuaijiao series. But hearing it from such a prominent practitioner and going into details about where, what, how, and why with certain aspects, it should be fascinating for everybody. So look out for that. That'll be coming in the next few weeks, hopefully. Manu and I sat down and watched it, paused, and extrapolated on aspects that were mentioned in the video. So it should be quite interesting for everybody to watch. Again, early access will be available to Patreon subscribers. And Patreon is one way you can support this podcast as well. As you guys are aware, the works that we do on both our YouTube channel and on this podcast is a labor of love. And it's only through your support that I'm able to continue to do this. To that end, I have two general support tiers on the Mushin Martial Culture Patreon page, and the third tier, which is actually the in-depth Huajin online learning program, which has been growing and has been developing really nicely for over 2 years now, with in-depth materials on Hebei Xingyiquan and Liang style Bagua Zhang, through which you can learn these systems in depth, in full, from anywhere you are. Currently, some of the new content that is being covered and presented with regards to Liang style Bagua Zhang is Lianhuan Zhang, which is our linking palms, and it is a major and important component of the Liang style Bagua Zhang curriculum. I actually have not really seen anybody present this material before, but I think that anybody who's interested in Liang style Bagua Zhang and Bagua Zhang in general would be quite keen to see this. It is a traditional and important component of Liang style Bagua Zhang as handed down by Li Ziming. With regards to Xingyiquan, we are still moving through the animals. We are still adding all sorts of partner and other drills, and that applies to both Xingyiquan and Bagua Zhang. And we're presenting these curriculums in full. So if you've ever been interested in learning Hebei Xingyiquan or Liang style Bagua Zhang and don't have a teacher nearby, check out the Huajin online learning program. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. All of those may be found at our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/Mushin Martial Culture. That's all one word, Mushin Martial Culture. Links are in the description. Alright, speaking about Mushin martial culture endeavors, we also have launched our website a few months ago, through which you were able to pre-order and now order the book Dragon Body Tiger Spirit, which was published a couple of months ago. And it is a translation and explanation of the Xingyiquan classics. Something, again, which I think was not available in this depth in the past in English, and it was something I'd worked on for more than 10 years. And the response from people has been very, very good. I've released some of the short reviews that prominent practitioners of these arts have made regarding the book following them reading the book. I have some more that I'll release, but the book is available through our website, which is mushinmartialculture.com, under the shop, in both hardcover and softcover, and it is also available to order directly through Amazon.com. On Amazon.com, you can get the hardcover and softcover version, as well as the EPUB or ebook version. So do check that out. If you're interested in the classical theories, in depth, with explanations, these aren't just simple translations, but they are explanations as well, check the book out. As mentioned before, Xing Yiquan's classical theory has been utilized by other arts, particularly those classified as internal arts, following their dissemination. Xing Yiquan theory and Xing Yiquan classic texts that are utilized verbatim within arts like Bagua, as well as Taijji Chuan and others. So this is, in some senses, a foundational work for the understanding of some of the underlying concepts, principles, and methods contained within the category classified as internal styles. Again, the book is available from mushinmartialculture.com in hardcover and softcover, as well as Amazon in 3 formats, including the EPUB and ebook versions. All right, let's get into today's episode. My guest today is Chen style practitioner and teacher Nabil Ranne. Nabil is a disciple of Chen Yu, who is the son of Chen Zhaokui and the grandson of Chen Fake, the esteemed teacher who brought Chen style Taijji literally into the modern age and into Beijing. Nabil now teaches the art in Berlin, Germany, and he also teaches at seminars, etc. around the world. He holds a doctorate in sports sciences, and he is particularly in love with Chen-style Taijji. Well, let's get right into it. I bring you Nabil Ranne. Oh, welcome to the Drunken Boxing Podcast. Very happy to finally be talking to you, Nabil Ranne. How are you today?
Thanks for the invitation, Byron. And I'm also really happy to kind of finally meet up.
Virtually, yeah. Yeah, one step up from text messages in a chat to an actual voice conversation. So, as we were saying earlier, the next step is to meet in person.
Exactly, yeah.
You're based in Berlin, am I correct?
Yes, exactly. I'm living in Berlin and teaching here and so on. And I originally come from Hanover, kind of central Germany.
Right. If you hear any thumping, it's because the apartment down from me is busy doing some renovations. They said they weren't going to do anything now, but I guess they are. Nothing too serious. That's not too distracting. So you're originally from Hanover. So you were born and raised and lived your whole life in Germany?
Yeah, it sounds a bit boring, right? But I think my name is usually more exotic than than my upbringing was, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what your background is with your name. Is it?
Well,
is your family originally from Germany?
Yeah, I mean, genetically speaking, I'm like a half-half. So my mother's German and a bit of Norwegian, but mainly German. And my father came from Syria. So when they met up in Berlin, and because they were both doctors, so they met at the hospital and then married, and
very interesting. Well, that's quite an interesting combination, Syrian and German. That's quite interesting. Do you speak any what language do they speak in Syria? Arabic?
Arabic, yeah, but I don't speak any Arabic, unfortunately. So I just have one mother tongue, and that's basically German. So I'm not very talented with languages, I think.
Well, I mean, it's a pity if you're dad, but it usually is the case with fathers, even if they're foreigners in a country. When they marry locally, it's usually if the mother is the foreigner that the child will learn the language. If it's the father, he'll kind of mostly just speak English or the local language, and that's about it. So I had the opposite to you. My mother was the foreigner, so she spoke to me in Greek, and my father spoke to me in English. So it's easy to learn languages when you're spoken to in that language from birth. So
yeah, I never thought about it, but you're right. We call it mother tongue, right? It's also like in Chinese, you say "mu yu," right?
Exactly.
So, in a way, It's interesting. Yeah, my father said he will always work long hours, so he didn't want to come back at night and then talk in a foreign language to his children, you know. So
Right, right.
in a way, yeah, that's
Well,
how it was.
you know, it's interesting. I have a lot of South African that I grew up in South Africa, a lot of South African local Chinese. And their
Mm.
parents or their grandparents were the first generation that came into South Africa. But a lot of them didn't speak any, or they don't speak any Chinese or Cantonese or, you know, Mandarin. And
Mm.
whenever I'd speak to their parents and ask them why you didn't teach your kids, you know, this language or speak to them in their native tongue, at least native in terms of where you're from, they would say to me, you know, we wanted our kids to have better opportunities than we did, and we wanted them to be as local as possible. So we wanted to make sure that, you know, their English was their main language. We didn't want to confuse things up with a foreign language, and it's kind of an interesting perspective if you think about it. You know, they're trying their best as foreigners in a country to assimilate as much as possible, and even to the extent that they think speaking to their kids in their own language at home would be holding them back in some way. It's, you know, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it was a bit the same in our family, but
Mm.
I mean, times have changed, so I think nowadays you would probably do it in a different way. But yeah,
Yes,
back then it was like that. So
for sure, for sure. And I mean, today I think people see additional languages as actually an asset that helps the kids get ahead, whereas back in the day it would be seen the opposite. And I think that has to do with well, just more cultures going into Western countries. Before it was very minor, and there was a kind of singularity with a term in terms of accepted culture. So nowadays it's the other way around. So it just shows that we've come a long way in society. That we're more open, and actually, it's desirable to have more cultures and different languages and different people in these countries. So it's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting perspective to hear from one generation or even two generations back.
yeah, I didn't know we have something in common there also.
Yeah. Well, you know, the funny thing with my mom is she was the foreigner in South Africa, but whenever she would speak to me in Greek, she would refer to the locals as foreigners. So yeah, I guess that's just a trait, you know. No, no, we're not the same as these guests, these foreigners. Our culture is different, you know. That I remember her always saying
Yeah.
things like that. You know, I'm like, hey, mom, we're the foreigners, by the way, just to let you know.
Yeah, that's a bit funny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right, well, let's get into your martial arts journey and your background. You're a Chen style Taiji Chuan practitioner. But maybe you can give some introduction about yourself and your background and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, sure. I'm usually really bad at introducing myself, but I'm trying every time. Yeah, when I was a kid, I grew up in a small village in central Germany, so there wasn't so much opportunity there. But I finally I got the chance to study some Taekwondo back then, and I kind of I didn't do it for too long, so I don't want to boast with anything I did do, but it kind of really shaped my early understanding of martial arts, and it really helped me to kind of gain flexibility and think about like martial situations, and it kind of really shaped me for a long time, though I didn't actually pursue it for too long, or I never really achieved much there, you know. And then I was a friend of mine at some point told me like he was really into Taiji, and I was like, oh, what is Taiji, you know? And he said, oh, well, it's like a martial arts mixed with meditation. And I thought, oh, that sounds really super, like, that sounds really awesome. And I always knew like that somehow I would, it's, yeah, it's a bit weird, but like when my father died, I was 13. So,
Oh,
and
sorry
I
to hear
remember like
that.
I was talking, well, yeah, it's life. But I was talking to my mother back then, and just at like we had dinner, I think, and she said, "Oh, what do you want to do and with your life in a way?" And I said, "Oh, I know at some point I will really go into Asian cultures and Asian traditions." And I didn't really know why I said it back then. I was 13 at the time. I didn't have a clue about anything, but it was really interesting. So I always had this kind of this pull towards these cultures and the martial arts, and I found it really interesting to kind of have a sort of like a practice which has some internal qualities, like meditative
Something introspective.
aspects. Introspective, yeah. I mean, the term meditation is a bit difficult, but that's what the guy said to me back then. So, and of course the martial aspects, and to have it somehow linked to one another. So that's what really kind of got me interested. And then I just visited my first school, and it was called like a Chinese boxing school. So Taijji Chuan was one of the aspects in that school, and I was really, when I started doing it, I was pretty hardcore, already. I was immediately going into the practice and training in a very kind of intense way. And yeah, and then I found Chen style at some point, and so I studied more in the what we call the village lines nowadays.
Right, right. We'll
And
get into that. I wanted to ask you before we get into
oh,
that about your
sorry,
what was your no worries. These conversations go where they need to go. But before I forget this, and before we move on to the topic, other topics, I wanted to ask you, what was your initial impetus though to start Taekwondo or martial arts? You started with Taekwondo, but what was the drive for that?
wow, that's really difficult. I have to get into my, I don't know, 11, 12, 13-year-old self. I think, I grew up in this village surroundings, and it was like a very like mainstream 80s German culture, which is not bad, but it's like my interests were different. I wasn't so much into football or like soccer back then, and I wasn't really into I don't know, like all the stuff they did. So I was just looking for something else, and I don't really know why. But then probably also because I watched Bruce Lee films and stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't actively pursue it back then, but it probably shaped me somehow. So I was just really looking for something else, and I found it. And also, I think I'm a bit, like it sounds a bit arrogant maybe, but no. But I think I'm a bit talented in this kind of movement.
Right.
I'm not. I think I'm not so talented in other kinds of movement necessarily, but I think in this kind of motoric skills, how you hone them in the martial arts, I felt attracted to it, and I thought, I think I was also good at it as a kid. So
Okay.
that's somehow a mix which kind of pulled me there.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. We have a similar impetus, and probably we grew up in similar years. What year were you born in, if I can ask?
75.
Ah, okay. So you're
I
a
think
couple.
you.
I'm a few years younger than you, but
Yeah.
our formative years were the 80s and the 90s and so on. So yeah, very similar. It was Bruce Lee, but for me at a very young age, I think I was about 5. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris, frankly speaking, was when I first saw those movies, I'm like, that's it, end of story. I want to do this stuff, right? And especially Bruce Lee, because his spirit kind of jumped out of the screen, irrespective of, hey, if you look at the movies today, you wouldn't say a lot of them were very deep and meaningful movies, but his spirit, it doesn't matter what movie you're watching, he just kind of grabs your attention and holds your attention for an hour and a half, and you walk out of that movie
Definitely, yeah.
thinking about that for weeks. So I guess it was something similar. I wonder how many people in our generation were motivated by the likes of Bruce Lee. It's probably quite a high percentage, the people that really got into
Yeah.
martial arts. So yes, so you said that you then moved on. Your friend told you about Tai Chi. I mean, Tai Chi. I don't even recall back then that it was even so well known. I mean, it really took off in the '90s, mid '90s onwards.
Yeah.
But yeah, back then that's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it was a couple of years later. So I was in England at the time. So, and one of my mates there, he just said like, "Oh yeah, I studied Taiji." So it was a bit later, like 7 years later or so. I had already stopped the Taekwondo practice, but I mean, funnily, I always pursued it myself, in a sort of like an autodidactic way. It never kind of left me completely. But it was so difficult to get there all the time. You needed a car and everything. It was really difficult. So, but when I was studying in England, so like my mate said, hey, he's doing it. And he said also like, yeah, I had to defend someone with it and so on. So I thought it was like, oh, okay, it's like a really martial practice, and I I never really thought about it. Like later, of course, a lot of people would say like, oh, Tai Chi is not really a martial art, is it? But my first like experiences with it were always like in a martial context. People were
Right.
defending themselves, or it was always about the practical application. So that probably also shaped me. I didn't go after. Sometimes I think I'm a pretty dumb person. I hadn't heard about the Tai Chi Chuan much at the time, so I was just like, oh, he's saying it's a martial art mixed with
Right.
meditation, so it must be a martial art mixed with meditation. I'm pretty simple in that regard.
Well, I mean, you obviously weren't aware, which became more better known as time went on. Or, it's quite interesting because even the way that Tai Chi in particular has developed outside of China in terms of practice and methods in over the last 20 years, when you looked at the first groupings of Tai Chi practitioners, it really was, and it was presented more as a holistic spiritual practice. The martial side of it was not was not so focused on. But then, as more and more versions of Tai Chi started to become available in the West, and as more and more skilled teachers started to teach in the West, that kind of changed. So it's quite interesting because you say that you were drawn to the martial side of it, but you didn't at that time know obviously much about the push, particularly at that time, of Tai Chi as a holistic spiritual practice, and that could have been born out of the rear end or the last part of the hippie movement in the 70s, etc. I mean, that did influence things. We've got to be honest about that. But it's quite interesting that you were looking at it from a Tai Chi a self-defense perspective, and then you got into Tai Chi. Most people would say, no, well, go do kickboxing or something like that, right? It's quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I was always like a bit drawn to that holistic side, but I mean, holistic in that sense definitely includes the martial side, I'd say. So yeah, I was drawn to it, and oh yeah, and like if I talk to like Chinese people about it, they will always say like, oh, that's Yuanfen, like how your way was, because sometimes I have the feeling like I didn't really do much, but I was always drawn to things in a way. My life shaped around me in a way that I could just basically go that way. So it's a bit weird in that regard. I feel like an active person, but with with my martial journey, I think it's always like I was almost pulled into one direction in a way.
Right, right. Well, yeah, the Chinese would always say, yeah, yeah. So your Yuanfen, your destiny was martial arts. They always say that,
Yeah.
and this is quite a common term in martial arts. They'll say, oh, you had a destiny to do martial arts, and you had a destiny to meet this teacher, etc., etc.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so that it could be. I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller, but you know, we walk this
Me
path, and
neither.
here we are. Yeah. When you were mentioning that you were in England, you were studying in England.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, now we're delving into my I don't know, into maybe a sad part of my life, but no, it's after school I didn't really know what to do actually. I was the youngest son of like I was the fourth son, so I didn't have to do military service. I didn't really know what to do. My father was dead. My mother was very like. Because her mother was very dominant, she was basically completely the opposite. Yeah. So like a yin yang sort of thing. And so she said, "Oh, you can do whatever you like." So I didn't really know what to do. And then at some point, I studied a bit of philosophy and English, and then I thought, okay, maybe I was playing the guitar also. So I went to England to study jazz guitar for a year,
Okay.
and I thought, okay, then I'll get more into the language. I'll do what I like. So, and then I'll see what happens. So that's why I was in England at the time.
Okay, that's quite an interesting path. Guitar, all sorts of things. Yeah, it's also quite interesting that you mentioned that your grandmother was quite overbearing, and your mom, because of that, was the opposite. Again, it's something similar with my mother. I mean, her traditional Greek parents are, you don't even get to choose what socks you're going to wear growing up, you are told. And she grew up in that kind of households, especially as a girl. I don't know if you know anything about Hellenic culture and daughters, but it's she comes from a time like when marriages were arranged still. That's the culture. So my mom was the exact opposite, similar to what your mom was, and she also gave me the freedom to pursue martial arts, which is what I loved. And it seems like your mom gave you this freedom too. I don't think if we had what we'd consider traditional parents, we would have been able to follow the paths the way we have, because it's just not normal, So I guess that's a blessing from your mom's side for you to have this freedom as well.
Yeah, definitely. But in the formative years, sometimes I think it's also good to kind of like have some ideas what to do. But no, I mean, I can't complain. My life gave me a lot. So, and I'm just trying to kind of give back,
So you went to England. Is that where you started doing Taijji?
No, when I came back to Germany, he was telling me about this. So I came back to Germany, and I was just telling a friend like, oh, I want to start this Taijji now. And then she said, oh yeah, my brother's going to a school and they're doing like street fighting there once a week and blah blah blah. And so again, my very simple mind said, oh, okay, that's apparently how people do Taijji. So I went to that school, and it was a very very colorful mix of Chinese martial arts and of practices. And the good thing was about it that it was very practical. It was a lot about experimenting with things. So I think that's probably one of the things which were the most important. So there was no woo stuff there going on.
Okay.
It was always about practical applications. I would say nowadays the level of knowledge was not so high necessarily in the traditional concept. So it was a bit more reconstructing the martial arts, how they probably work, rather than how they actually work. You know what I mean?
Okay. Was the teacher, was he a German guy, somebody from China? Do you want to talk about that or not?
Oh yeah, he was a German guy, but yeah, I don't know if nowadays he would. I'm still on good terms with him, but it's a bit complicated sometimes in the martial arts, So,
I know.
But it was a Chinese boxing, so it's a long time now. But I cherish the good things about it,
Okay. So of course, I mean, I also had experiences through my martial journey, training with people that I'm still, fond of, in terms of we have a relationship, and as people, I think, they're decent people. But in terms of access to knowledge and what they were teaching, that was something else. But then again, as you said, there were good aspects to it. And there was also the fact that it was a different time when access to such things were very limited. So the little access, or even the little productive components of or legitimate components of their syllabus are still more than you would have gotten elsewhere. So yeah, it is what it is. I mean, this is the history. I think people today kind of take it for granted, the access that they have to legitimate and good teachers, both in person and online. If we go back 20 years, I mean, to find a Kung Fu magazine for me was like finding gold, I used to drive 2 hours to this little shop that might have it, and then buy whatever you can find. Yeah. And now you just turn on Google. So I think people take it for granted, but we can't really judge the past with our understanding today on some things. On some things you can, but not on everything.
So. Yeah, I think we have to be careful not to become arrogant. I mean, the level of knowledge is always different, and just like you say, like in the 60s, of course, there was maybe one Chinese person coming to teach, and then, of course, everybody had to believe him if he was good or not. by Chinese standards, nobody knew. And then, of course, the internet changed everything, and a lot for the good. But I mean, also we know some of the bad aspects of the internet and how people communicate there and judge other people there and so on. So it's always like a two-edged sword in a way, right? So,
Well,
but we're all standing on the shoulders of our ancestors. So
exactly. As long as we're taking 2 steps forward with every 1 step back, we're still making progress. So that's okay. It's when you take 2
very
steps
well
back
said.
and one step forward, then we have a problem. So did you got introduced to Chinese martial arts and martial arts in the sense in general at this German school, and how did you go more deeply into Tai Chi from there?
Yeah, my focus was always a bit on Tai Chuan. So I studied a couple of the other martial arts, but my focus was always on the Tai Chi. I don't really know why again, but maybe because I was somehow drawn to it. So I and it because it was like basically a very eclectic sort of school. And then the person in the US, he got really interested in Chen style, and basically included it as a mix into the whole eclectic system, or he was teaching it separately. I don't. I hope people don't take every word and
Gospel.
interpret it in a political way. I gotta be careful. Like I just want to he became a 2D of Chen Xiaowang later.
Okay.
So and he was still practicing and teaching that system in a and not in an eclectic way, but his whole system is more like it's very principle based, and so they are more like different martial arts done in a very practical sort of way. So. And then for the first time, I heard about Chen style, and my teacher always said we practice a mix between Yang style and Chen style.
Interesting.
Nowadays, again, I would judge it in a bit of a different way, but that's what I heard back then. So I was interested in it. I told him, oh, maybe I can do something with Chen style. And so he said, yeah, of course, do it, which later also led to our separation in a way. But in the beginning, he was like,
supportive.
Yeah, you can try it out.
Yeah.
In the beginning he was supportive, and later when I really got into it, he didn't like it so much anymore. But anyway, it was good for me, and then I started doing the Chen style system, which of course basically one of the maybe the most mainstream one, the most popular one, where you can actually get teachers. So that's how I got into Chen style. So
village derived. So
yes,
Chen
exactly.
Zhaokui derived.
Yeah, the Chen Xiaowang Association,
okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, in those days, again, whatever we're looking at in hindsight, it was one of the first, and then of course the most widespread grouping of people that were teaching Chen style internationally were through the Chen Xiaowang particularly, as well as a couple of others. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's nowadays. I know it's quite different in all in different countries. For example, in most European countries, it's quite really different. But in Germany, it's really just Chen Xiaowang, you could say, or almost only. But then in Italy, I think it's quite different, and in Spain. So it's interesting. But the way these arts came into the West, it's originally it's quite often in a very monolithic sort of way,
yes.
like just one art in a way.
Yes.
But then, of course, at some point we get more diversity, and other people come, other teachers come, and everything becomes a bit richer. I think, which is also more healthy in a way.
We've seen that with Wing Chun. I mean, Wing Chun is one of the easiest and the best examples to see the proliferation and the evolution of a Chinese style over time in the West. So the first groupings that came out were all primarily drawn from one teacher. And that was the Hong Kong line of one teacher that started being taught in the West. But over the years, and particularly in the last 10, 15 years, you see other smaller lineages come out. And they're, in some senses, quite different. Even some of the Foshan lineages starting to be taught outside of the mainland and in the West. And then you can see, well, it's not so singular as we thought it was. There's quite a bit difference there. So it's a very, very...
Yes, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I read this book. I can't remember the name. history of Wing Chun, I thought it was really interesting how, especially like before Ip Man, you don't have too much info. You don't know too much about all the lineages, right? So
Right.
and he kind of streamlined everything. So and this is basically how you come to know it. And of course, you can see that in different arts, in other arts too. Right? It's quite an interesting.
Is the book you're
feature of
referring
history.
to the one by Judkins?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite a good book. I mean, it's quite interesting, especially the research of the roots of Wing Chun in the last. I don't practice Wing Chun, but it's just I'm fascinated by martial arts history and evolution because they're really a story of people more than they are
Exactly.
a story of art. But anyway, yeah, it's quite interesting to see the more information coming out over the years of the origins and even the logic behind the change in the narrative. So, I mean, we know, for example, the older myth of the creation can't be traced really further back than Yip Man himself, and there's a lot of similarities with the White Crane origin story. So
Mm.
there's a lot to be. I'm not by no means a Wing Chun historian. I've just
No,
cursory
I think we have something
investigation.
in common. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was a bit of a time lag. I didn't want to interrupt
No,
you.
no, no, no.
I
Go
think we
ahead.
have a bit of in common there. I'm not a Wing Chun enthusiast. I mean, I like it. I like most martial arts, So, but I'm not specialized in it. But I found the historical notes really interesting. And if you compare it, for example, to Taiji Chuan, like in Taiji Chuan, there's so much political um, discussion and nonsense also sometimes written about the histories. And whereas, and if, but like most martial arts, we don't know too much about their roots in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the 18th century, we usually know less. And it's quite common in most martial arts because of, I mean, you know all this, but the Confucian way, like which arts were being practiced, which arts were being frowned upon. I mean, that was also similar in the West. If you're like you were specialized in self-defense and fighting and so on, people wouldn't think it's like a high-class job, So people quite often people would be illiterate, so they couldn't write about it. So other people had to write about it. So there are a
Exactly.
couple of mechanisms in place. So we don't know too much about it, and I think we just have to kind of live with this insecurity and then fill it with meaningful interpretation of what we know. And
Right.
then there will always be points which we can discuss, but it's always a bit silly when somebody says like, "Oh, I know how it was in the 18th century." It's like, of course you don't.
Well, it's such to really understand these things, you need multi-disciplines, like multiple disciplines of understanding.
Mm,
The actual people and their history and who learned from who is only a very small part of the big picture because social status would be another one of those people.
mm,
The current conditions in that time, so what was society like in that time, so his place in that society. The terrain was another important thing. So where was it being practiced? All of these
yeah,
things, like and you can even see it with Wing Chun, but with everything you can see how these elements affect. It's quite interesting. I was training. My teacher taught me a spear routine, quite an old traditional spear routine. It has and we use a big spear, and it has 19 sections. So to do the form, it takes a very long time. But what I noticed was it would be one section going out, doing a bunch of techniques, and then you turn around in this bracing posture and just walk back with the spear held in a specific way. That was line 2.
hmm
And then go back, line 3, doing a bunch of techniques. Line 4, turn the spear, brace it in a specific way, and walk back. And it was so often that the even lines were like that, and it didn't make sense to me. One day I was practicing at home, but it was raining outside, so I took my spear outside of my apartment in front of the elevator in the corridor there, which is where I train when it's
hmm
raining. And I was reviewing these lines, but before I was doing that form, I was doing basic drills up and down, and
hmm
my spear was too long to turn around in the corridor. So I would do one line out of techniques and then just walk back with a spear. And then I thought to myself, don't waste this walking back, do something. So I did that bracing technique and walked back. And then I went, aha, maybe this routine was created in a narrow area, you know? And I have no way to prove this, but it shows how these things affect what gets handed down. And you can miss that if you don't look at all these little details. You can kind of misunderstand why something is done a certain way or why it exists. So it's the same with all
and then we can discuss it, you know, if it's like a useful interpretation or not, or if there could be another opinion, because there will never be a right or wrong about it. You can just have like a useful interpretation of what you do, and it sounds you know, very logical what you say. And I think, like you say, it's like the cultural aspects, the linguistic aspects, the oral tradition aspects, maybe the written record, if there is any, and then also the motorical aspects, you know, like how do the movements look? How are they done? Are there the same movement concepts there? So I think if we added like all these disciplines, and then people could really meaningfully probably discover more about the historical facts of the arts. Yeah.
For sure. Well, we kind of went off there. You were saying that you started getting into Chen Xiaowang lineage or derived Chen practice. So that was when you started going into that. Was there anybody specific that you were training with in Germany at the time with that when you started going down that route?
Yeah, I was training with Jan Silbersdorf, who's well known, and I was going to Chen Xiaowang seminars, and I think Chen Zhaokui came out at the time, so it was, I think, one of his first seminars internationally. I went there, and I met Chen Yingjun. I studied with him, and I hope I'm not forgetting anyone now. But yeah, it's, you know, I was at the end. I was training it kind of full time, and I noticed that I had really gained some good aspects from the practice. But there were other aspects where I thought, okay, I'm really kind of missing it, and I didn't really have the methodology to train it. And I kind of thought, okay, I know the system by now, but I also thought, okay, I want to really work more closely with a teacher who's got a super high level, you know, because I was thinking like, okay, it will become a very important part of my life. So I need to kind of have more experiences with it and understand it a bit more. So that's how Chen Yu came into the game, you know.
Well, that's quite an interesting route, because it is disconnected or separate in general from the village derived. So how did you get to this idea and connected with Chen Yu, or even did you know about those differences?
No, fortunately, I didn't know anything about those differences because, again, my primitive mind comes into play, because I don't even know if I would have thought, okay, it's something different. I don't know if I would have picked it up, to be honest, you know, because maybe I would have shied away. It's a bit like nowadays. I see some people say, oh, no, maybe it's different, or my teacher says it's different, so I'm not trying it out. I can actually really understand that, because I might have thought the same, but I thought, oh, Chen style is Chen style. Right. So, and I wasn't trained deeply in the methodologies of Chen style. I didn't really, you know, I was basically, I think the methodology was reduced to certain aspects and then the external frames. But I mean, this is my personal point of view. I mean it in a very technical sort of sense. Yeah? I hope people don't think I'm talking in a political realm now or whatever. But to me, personally, I was thinking, okay, I was later thinking that the methodology I had learned before was just reduced to certain things, you know, mainly to the Xia Chen and, you know, the thinking and the Fangsung and this sort of practice. And so I gained stability, but I think I lost a lot of dynamic things. And then I remember I was seeing a picture of Chen Yu in a magazine, and I immediately had this feeling like, okay, I would practice with this person in my life. I knew it, you know. And even if it took me a couple of years from there, but I knew that I would practice there one day. So that's when I'd been to China before, but then I kind of at some point in my life when it was feasible, I just went there and started to study. So he taught me, like, it was winter at the time, it was February, and so it snowed, and I went to the hotel. We wanted to meet at Tiantan Gongyar, in the heaven.
Temple of Heaven.
How do you say it in English? Like the Temple of Heaven Park.
Yeah.
So we went to the hotel instead, and it was great. He was showing me so many things, and I thought, oh, okay, this is Chen style. I didn't know that there was any differences at the time.
Yeah.
It was only later when I came back and I tried to implement those things into my practice that other people said, oh, somehow you're doing it differently. But then, because every time I visited and studied with Chen Yu, and then I went abroad to study more, so like at some point, this information, of course, shaped my complete practice. So, and I just stopped training what I did before. It was just like I don't know, a snake sheds its skin when it grows. It just in my practice grew. So I developed a different practice, and of course then at some point I did Baishi and so on. So because it was like a logical consequence, and then of course I had understood the differences, but before I didn't understand anything,
Right. What did you saw a photo of Chen Yu, you said in a magazine. Was it conscious or something subconscious that jumped out at you?
I think it was subconscious. If you had asked me back then, I think I would have said something like his kung fu shows, or maybe I would have said something like how maybe his pungent, it looks so expansive, so relaxed and so intent. I wouldn't have really grasped exactly what I was attracted to, but something like this probably I would have said.
Okay, well, subconsciously you identified something different, something special, and something meaningful. So how did you go about getting in contact with him?
There I'm not really sure. I wanted to go with my teacher back then, but then he didn't have the time, so I just went alone, and I got Chen Yu's number from a contact. I'm not sure about which contact, to be honest. I can't remember that. Basically, I just went to Beijing and called him.
Okay.
And and somehow we met every day then for a couple of hours, and I don't know, he had so much time back then. It's really astonishing from to think about it now, but we just spent the days, and also just went shopping. I went to his home and so on, but and we were always training in my hotel room, so we didn't have so much space.
Right.
But I remember he said to me like, oh yeah, you do the form now, and I was like, oh, I started with the 75 form, from the Chen Zhaokui sort of lineage, and at some point I thought, oh no, but he's Chen Parker's grandson, so I should do the 83 form, what people call Xinjia nowadays.
Yeah.
So I started to change in between, and he laughed at me. He said, oh, you have to decide which form you want to do. So it was fun. Fond memories.
What year was that you first traveled out and started training?
2007.
Okay.
That was when I started to practice with him. Yeah.
So you mentioned that over the years of traveling and training with him, and then absorbing and learning his method, and people even saying that something's different, and then, what would you say are the core differences between the Chen Fake Beijing-derived lines of Chen style compared to the more widely practiced Chen Shaowang or village lines?
I can talk about my personal experience. Yeah. So I don't mean this in a political sense. It's just very important because people take everything nowadays, and
I know.
the way they talk about it, you can't really control it anymore. So, but my personal experience was, well, nowadays first of all I would say that the Chen style in practice in Chen Zhaokui in China and the Chen style which is being practiced in the West is not necessarily the same.
Okay.
That's one distinction I think we have to make. People are quite often not aware of it, but I think we should be aware of it. So when I studied with Chen Yu, I was not really, I wasn't interested anymore in the Chen Zhaokui lineage. So, but that also means that I'm not an expert in what exactly they teach there. Because also I think teachers there are actually quite different. If you look at the movements, they are not the same. If you think about like the jins they use, they're not the same. So people are usually not thinking about it in such a technical and specific kind of way, so they don't notice because they think, oh, like the principle of Fang Sung is the same of relaxation, But I think nowadays I have a very much more detailed and specific kind of view of all those people, but I'm a bit careful because I did not practice their style. So, but the main difference I think in the Chen Fake line and what Chen Yu teaches is that it's about Jin, force.
Right.
So, and if you think about Jin, your whole practice changes. And what I had learned before, it was never about Jin. People might have used the word, but it was not the way I would use the word nowadays, or I would
find that
train
word. Yeah, I find the word Jin and Fa Jin used in the West in such a strange and inaccurate and incorrect manner. I mean, never mind Jin and Li, the difference is rarely understood, but also the term Fa Jin and Fa Li is often misused. And it's come to the point that I don't even address it when people are talking about it anymore, because if they're using it in the wrong way, then what am I going to tell them, right? It's like having to build the building from the floor up, from the ground up again.
Yes, and when people don't accept you as a teacher, whatever that means, I don't mean it like in a super, high fly, arrogant sort of way. But if people want to discuss with you rather than learn from you, you cannot solve this problem for them. You can discuss with them, but you can discuss for the next 100 years, and they will not learn it. So if people want to learn from you, that you can tell them and you can teach them properly. I think that's, and like you say, the term Jin, I think now when I listened to what you said, I had the idea that probably the misunderstanding comes from the fact that, of course, we don't have that term in our languages usually. We have similar terms, but not exactly the same. And then we are basically, when somebody talks about it, we are looking for the external, the outcome of an action. So it's like, oh, somebody's doing Fa Jin, so that is a Jin, But I think to properly understand the term, one would need to have the kinesthetic and practical knowledge, which is being shaped by those martial practices, by standing, breathing, having, the central alignment, the three external, you need a certain methodology to understand, okay, this is what they mean with the Jinlu, with the Jin path. And then you understand, okay, how are they connected with your center, and how these internal dynamics actually yield the external outcome. But the actual practice of like the how you shape your body, without the knowledge of understanding the practice and the kinesthetic knowledge, you can't really explain that, I think, very well. Yeah. That's the thought which I just had when you talked about it, because I think people in the West who don't have that methodology, it's difficult to tell them without giving them also the kinesthetic knowledge, right?
Yeah. And also the perspective of the use of the term in Chinese and what it means, So there's a lot that needs to be added. I also think there's a stigma that's been it's an artificially created meaning that has stigmatized the term in the West because it's just been used in that way for so long. So it's very hard to change that or to fix it.
Yeah, I think we can see that with a couple of terms, right? Like qi would be, of course,
And
of
that's the
course,
other one. Yeah.
the original. Or like some people say like E is a difficult term, or um, and of course it's, I mean, translation is always difficult, and then of course like in a high context language like Chinese, it's even more difficult.
Right.
Um, but it's still interesting. I mean,
Yeah. So you mentioned that your initial observation was that the jin was quite different in your practice that you were doing, which was from the Chen Fake derived line. How so?
yeah. Well, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think that that we talked about Jin would be the first difference. Not even the specific Jin would be different. That's also what comes out of it. But even that the whole practice is being shaped by how and what Jin you create is different. Because then you start to like see the like what we could call principles. Like I think the term is difficult in the West, but it's quite widely used. But I mean, in Chinese, we don't really use the term, right? It's more like usually we talk about requirements or something like that. So, or essentials or something like this. So, but like what we would call principles in the West usually means something like relaxation or the central alignment and these kind of things,
Right.
and these are all good, and they all have to be in place, but they have to be in place for a reason. And the reason is that we want to create certain jin with it. So, and then things become more specific. So all the practice is being shaped by this, like you have the he jin. And where do you have the he jin? Like the closing coordinating forces, or you have them in different body parts. So you can actually, you learn to how really like coordinate your body in a completely new way, and then all the folding actions and everything is like the consequence of you wanting to create a certain jin. So, and without wanting to do something like that, it's like basically the whole practice becomes different.
Right.
And then
Right.
Chen Yu is a very practical sort of person. So the art becomes quite complex and detailed, and also internally really fascinating. And I think you probably can uh, you probably have the same in your practice, so
Yeah.
I think you can uh, relate to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Xingyi is quite a, from the initial practices, which are the foundational practices, which are usually Santi Shi and its related aspects. But the first thing you start working on is the five elements, and they're literally five vectors or five types of jin, really. So it's it's quite interesting because again, people try to see them as five techniques or even five applications, and that's kind of missing the point, of what you're doing as the foundation. But I relate in that regard for sure with how we develop those, and those vectors of power are not just simply power that's issued in a certain direction, but the body mechanics that create them. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on with body mechanics that then manifest this type of power or vector as well, which then is added to, used, and mixed with the subsequent techniques and methods that you learn later on. But the first stage is that refinement of each one very clearly, and it's not just the power or the force that comes out, but the required body mechanics that support and develop it. So I guess in
Yeah,
some senses it's very similar.
I think it is. I think it's just Thingy starts out with and now I use a term which I don't mean in a derogatory sense, like in a simple way, which I think is like, I could also say it's in a more clearer way. I think it's like to work with the five vectors. It's actually, I think it's really useful. If I was a modern coach and I wanted to like invent a system, I think it's like like a great idea to start with something simple, building the body mechanics and the vectors, and then expanding on it and becoming more complex. And I think in Tai Chuan, I can be very critical about my own my own practice. So I think in Tai Chuan sometimes all the forms and the choreographies, they're so complex that to discover the Jin inside is actually
Difficult.
it takes some time. you know. So I quite like the Xingyi approach, to be honest. Um, but then I think what it leads to, it can be actually a bit similar. And that's what I
Yeah.
definitely see from Chen Yu Taijji. Like nowadays, if I look at other arts, I would say a lot of like good Xingyi Chuan practice or Xingyi also, they that we share something, you know.
Yeah, of
Whereas I
course.
quite often look at other Taiji practices, for example, and I quite often, I say, okay, actually we don't share so much, even if the outside form is a bit similar, but what we do inside the forms is actually not so similar, you know.
Yeah, you know, that's actually something I wanted to ask your observations on. So you did have some experience with Yang style, I take it previously. Yeah.
Yeah, a bit.
O- Okay. Well, I don't know how much you've looked at the classical Yang style, Wu style, Sun style, and Wu style forms. I don't know if you've taken the
I've,
time
I've,
to look at them.
yes, I have. Yeah.
And based on your experience with Chen style, can you see the root of well, I mean Chen style at least in those? Can you see that yes, this is just one evolution in a certain direction that created Yang style, for example, or created Wu style, but you can see where inside there you can see its root or its basis, which was Chen style. What are your observations?
Yeah, you know, in around 2008, 2009, I think um, I looked at all the classical texts of also of Yang style, you know, and I mean, which were probably all written in the Wu family, you know, by Wu Yuxiang and these people. So they were, but I mean, people call them sometimes the Yang style classics. So,
Right.
and I was actually at the time because I was learning from Chen Yu, and I thought, wow, it's really astonishing that a lot of the terms are actually the same, exactly the same. So this is what at that time I thought, okay, I can really rarely trust any Western translations anymore because I thought quite often they would not see the technical aspects which are actually described in the texts
Right.
because they can't really they interpret the words in a different way. But I at the time because I was learning that kind of very detailed way, so I thought, okay, but they mean something very specific here. So that was just my first observation from more textual observation, but I think it can add something to your question. So,
Right.
and then of course, if you see the other practices, I think you can see the origin of Chen style. I mean, the choreographies are basically they're the same. I
Yes,
mean,
that's
just
what I noticed.
looking, yeah, very
Yeah.
superficially. And then the old Wu style is, I mean, you rarely see it actually, right? But I mean, the last time I saw someone doing it, I thought there was a lot of spiraling action and so on into it. And I think the Yang style, which we now see nowadays mostly, I mean, I think it's a simplification. So a lot of the spiraling and so on is gone, and they have a lot of like stable final postures, right? So I would say I can definitely see the relationship there, and but I'm also a bit careful because I'm not like I don't have an inside perspective in a genuine, authentic young style lineage, and I don't know how they complement
Right.
uh,
Right.
what I see on externally. You know, like I don't know that, but I think the historical roots are actually quite clear if you think from a movement perspective.
Yeah, so they're probably a lot closer related than people actually superficially see, or that people that only practice one or might not go deeper into it would realize. They wouldn't realize that it's actually a lot closer than what you think. It's it's quite interesting, specifically from the choreography point of view for me, because again, I'm not a Taiji practitioner, but this was something that interested me. So it was very interesting to me because we all always think of styles being something completely separate, you know. this
Yeah.
style and that style, Yang style and Chen style are different styles, therefore they're completely different. But from the choreography point of view, I already saw, whoa, there's a lot of, it's basically the same. It's basically the same, and that's quite interesting.
Mm.
That for me, that was very interesting, just to see, because it shows you some. And again, like I said, I'm not a Yang style or even a Tai Chi practitioner. There's some underlying reason why each one went in the particular direction they went. Of course, I wouldn't be able to say what it is, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. I think it's like if you compare the weapon forms, it's actually even closer. I think, and that's basically if you think from a like a movement perspective, it's like if you have a sword, it's quite clear that like you can cut with the edge or you can pierce
With the tip.
with the tip or whatever. So or you can hit someone with a handle also. So somehow the gin you produce are kind of they're not so
Limited in
versatile, you
scope,
know?
yeah. Yeah, they're limited in
Yeah.
scope, yeah.
So I think we don't see so much variance in the way these forms are being practiced. So whereas in the hand forms, the deviation comes quicker. So for example, in recent times, if you look at like more the Chen Fake students or even the Chen Zhaokui students, especially the Chen Fake students, I think they all look quite different. You know, they also have sometimes different concepts and so on. So even there, you can see, okay, in one
Well,
generation,
give some examples of who. Just if people want to take a look for themselves, if they can find some video of these people, and then,
yeah, I
so.
mean, Chen, for example, is like Tian is yeah, it has a very specific sort of way how he does his form, right?
Right.
Then of course you could say Wu Liuxin is like, I mean, he was eclectic, he was doing many styles, but again, he has this version of Chen style, which I think it also shows a lot of like the Gungbu, like the young style sort of Gungbu stances
Right.
and so on. But it's so his prior experience has shaped his study, you know, with Chen Fake. And then Feng Zhejiang, of course, if you see his look at the older videos.
Older videos, yeah.
And then of course his younger videos look different again. So even there you see like an evolution in just one person, you know.
Right.
So and which is also quite logical. So um, your practice will hopefully when you're 20, it will hopefully be different when you're 50.
Yeah.
You know, and I
Yeah.
say hopefully because people quite often say, oh, deviation is always bad. But if you think about like deviation can also be evolution, so it can also be good. It depends on your personal
Well, it
path,
couldn't.
you know.
It could be you mistaking the refinement of something as being deviation. It might not be
Yes.
deviation. It might just be refinement, but you haven't been able to identify it. So I found the same thing. I mean, if you look at my teacher or his teachers, my martial uncles in their younger days to their older times, things changed. Not in so much in terms of principle, underlying methods, roots, ideas, etc., but certain things changed, and there's many reasons depending on the person, but
Yeah.
they shouldn't be thrown out as okay, it's deviation, therefore it's wrong. I mean, what kind of
No.
deviation? I mean, if you're breaking principles, okay, we can have a discussion about it being wrong, but if that's not the case, then you need to try to identify what's different and why.
Yeah,
So,
I think like if in Chen style, for example, if you look at the social and cultural, like the hotbed, like the Henan sort of origin, if you look at the different practices there, the small frame practice, the Jiaobao practice, and even the old Wu Yuxiang sort of lineage, and then the Chen style lineage, you see a lot of similar things actually. So a lot of similar practices. I think so. You can gain an understanding of like, oh, okay, these are some aspects of the art, and then of course there's individual difference,
preferences, yeah.
and and it should be that way, I think also. So and like personally, I always say it's like we have stages of learning. When you're learning in art, you're learning the principles. You have a stage of training, you know, you're trying to put the principles into the body, And then you have a part of cultivation where you're using the principles for your personal spiritual or health benefit, or however you want to call that. So you're making the principles your own. You're not, so I think these three stages, like in a personal training life, they come together, and also different parts of your life. So when I was training with Chen Yu, of course, I took everything he told me and put it into my body. But now, of course, if I get up sick, maybe I got a flu or whatever, then maybe I'm not going into deep stances and training all the He-Jin and blah, blah, blah. But I'm just using the practice to benefit myself. So, and then I think that should be that way. It's not like, oh, now it's not real Taiji anymore, but I'm using the Taiji for my life. And I think all these stages we can probably find in all these arts.
Well, there's also the aspect of each person's physical abilities or disabilities. I knew a Xingyi teacher, quite well known, I won't mention names, who had a hip problem, and and due to that his posture was affected in a certain way, and therefore some of his techniques were affected in a certain way. But he did it, in that way and made it work for him. However, his students imitated this issue, and they didn't have hip problems. So, these kind of things happen too. Personal preference also occurs. For example, in Xingyi Quan we have 12 animals, and my teacher would always say, you need to find the one or the ones that you have the most affinity for, and those are the ones that you will make your own and focus on. Of course, you practice the others, but the ones that you will go deeper into are the ones that you personally have an affinity for. And everybody is different. So I wouldn't have the same affinity as my teacher, and he wouldn't have the same as his teacher, because they're different people, different body types, different mentalities, different dispositions, all of these things. So there's a lot more to it than just what people think, We're not carbon copies of each other. And, you can see it with school even. You can have your classmates all learning in the same maths classroom, and the one goes on to become a rocket scientist, and the other one goes to work at the supermarket as a cashier. You don't come out with the same results in the exams or in the same result in life. So, because you have the same input, it doesn't mean you'll have the same output.
And I think, like, as a coach of Chinese martial arts, it's somehow, I mean, that's what I'm trying to do, but I'm you're never perfect, but I'm trying to be like clear and concise in my teaching, and to be like strict in that regard. But then at the same time, or maybe another time, also to allow organic growth and individuality and like freedom and practice and experimenting with stuff. So, and I think it's like a yin and yang balance, sort of. Like, if people never experiment with the jin, and they feel their bodies and they make mistakes and so on, they cannot really learn. If they're like sometimes adhering too strictly to everything, it's difficult for them to understand when they are not adhering to the principles. You have to make mistakes so you understand why you want to make it differently. So I think these two aspects are really important to on the one hand, be concise and clear in your teaching, because without that, I mean, you don't really have much to teach, But on the other hand, not to limit the growth of your students, because then you just get like followers, like you say, like bad carbon copies of yourself. And personally, that's not something I want to achieve with my students,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's completely true. But also the stages of the students' training also determines the level to which they will have less or more freedom. Of course, before they have foundational aspects developed, you don't want them to start trying to go and experiment and mess things up. One thing my teacher, he would always have a kind of a saying. He would say, like, if it feels stronger, it's better. So how does it feel? Oh, it feels... So if your arm is here, is it stronger? Yes or no? It is. You can generate more force. You feel more comfortable, etc. Then that's better. If you're doing it in another way and it's uncomfortable, you're unable to develop force. It just doesn't feel good. then it's not better. But you need to find out why that is. So for him, it's all about feeling. But like I said, it depends on the stage at which the student is. Because the ability to discern and understand this feeling is also limited by your experience and knowledge. So it is exactly as you said, a yin and yang.
Yeah, it's like that's why I think we have to accompany our students in a good way, you know. But like I know Chen Zhaokui, he wrote about this. Like there are two stages in Tui Shou. One is like learning the pattern and the routine, and the second one you have to try it out for yourself because the teacher cannot give it to you anymore. And like you say, it's like, and of course the first stage is first, and the second stage is second, and then of course there's always a like a bit of a mix somehow. And I think nowadays, like sometimes when I teach stuff for like how do you want to shape your leg, for example, so you're strong, you're stable, you're also flexible, and you're not like ruining your joints, you know, like your knee joints or whatever. So I'm teaching the principles, but then when I see someone thinks they're doing it, but they are actually not really doing it, so they apparently their feeling is not cultivated enough, right? So they can't differentiate it, and then I'm telling them to make conscious mistakes, for example, like you put your knee here or there or whatever, or you have someone push you, blah blah
Oh,
blah.
exactly.
So people say, okay, this, and then I say, okay, now we've done the mistake. Now that's what we don't want to do.
Oh,
So now we
exactly.
can kind of step back, you know.
Yeah, that's
And I think
a very good manner. That's a very good way to do it.
yeah, because like of course we can always take the principle, and you know the principle in martial arts is all the same, and we're all the same. It's like Taijji Ijia, you know, we are like one family. But on the other hand, we can also say like, okay, there are differences, and it's not bad, and so we can make our practice more specific with these things. And like myself, I learned a lot from the Chen Xiaowang system because I know exactly what the difference is to the system I'm practicing now. You know,
Yes.
so if I had not done the other system before, I think, and Chen Yu would have just taught me things, I would have probably said, okay, that's how people do it. But I wouldn't have had the experience to compare it with anything and to really get into my body. Like with the differences, I think we can actually, our mind works that way. So first we have to cherish the differences, and later we can overcome them and integrate more, you know.
Right, right. So you teach in Germany. You also have your Chen style Taijji network that you've set up. The proliferation or the amount of people or practitioners derived from the Beijing line compared to the Zhengzhou lines in Germany in general and Europe in general, are there many people that are from a Beijing derived line, or not so many?
No, not so many. I mean, nowadays, um, yeah, it's not so many. But I mean, the Beijing derived lines would of course also include other lines, like all the
Yeah.
Chen Fake lines, probably. So there most, I mean, in Germany, I don't think there are many people. There are some people who are practicing those systems, but I don't think there are many, or I don't think there. I might be wrong here, yes. So I'm sorry if somebody listens and I'm saying it wrong. I don't think there are any like 2D or like Dide of any of like Feng
Disciples.
or someone. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
disciples. So, but like the Chen Yu line, of course, I think there are only like 3 or 4 people in teaching internationally. So like outside of China,
Yeah.
and so we are very like few people here. Yeah, and I started to do the network as you know, because my kung fu brother and me, we started teaching at the same time here in Germany. So we said, oh, why not cooperate and do something together, you know? So
Right, right.
it started as a very like low key sort of thing, but then unfortunately we got a lot of enthusiasts and people who really want to delve deep into the arts, and so and then of course with COVID, I mean, probably it's the same for you. We all started like online programs, and
Yeah.
so now it's become a bit more international in a way. Yeah, which
Well,
is
yeah,
nice.
exactly.
I like that.
You mentioned your kung fu brother. Is he somebody who also studies under Chen Yu?
Yes,
Ah, okay.
we went there quite often. So he's like my younger kung fu brother, and we're friends. But he's not now. He's not teaching so much anymore. But it's more like a personal choice of
Practice.
him. But
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
we
All right. Okay. Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. Would you would you say that you've had interest from the Chen village people or lines in Europe into your teachings? Would you say that they're open to coming to try learn or to see what it is or to understand the practices and their differences, or are they a little bit more reserved?
is any of us open? That's I don't know. It's no. I think it's both a bit. No, I think most people are very reserved, um, and I think it's also a bit like more the political or organizational aspects.
Right.
That of course, like if you have an organization which is a bit hierarchical, then you're not necessarily telling your people to go and study somewhere else. You
No,
know.
of course.
So and on the one hand, I'm always like I'm a pretty like I think I'm a socially kind of okay guy, so I like to cooperate and to talk to people and so on. But of course, there's also like a mm, where does it make sense and where does it not make sense, you know? So it depends a bit. But I think
I
like
see.
a lot of people don't really come, but I think some might take notice, but they don't really understand the methodology, I think.
Yeah, but I would have thought that looking at that, it would make them curious, you know? I mean,
Yeah,
for example, with
some it
me,
does.
when I see other practices of Xing Quan and there's something peculiar about it, I'm sometimes curious to go understand what that is, to look into it at least, you know? Politics aside, obviously. So,
Yeah, I would hope that, I mean, in a way, Chinese lineages are all a bit more like limited, I think, like not limited, but uh, less overlap with other practices than, I mean, if you're, I don't know, studying MMA or something, I don't think you have a problem going to one studio and then another one and so on, you know, because like in the Western sports sphere anyway. And then in the Chinese lineages,
it's a little
also
bit more
it
closed.
makes it's a bit closed, and it does not make too much sense, to be honest, at some point anymore. But I mean, if that also creates a mindset which is very closed, I think it's a bit sad.
Yeah.
If it means like you are specializing in a certain movement practice, I think it's okay. If your mindset is also becoming closed, it's not so good. But so I do have some students, you know, I also have like people who have been disciples from like 19th generation Chinese teachers. So, and who now study with me. So I do have people who found it interesting, but it's more like those who've already reached a certain point in their art, and then they want to like progress further. You know,
Right.
they were looking for something where they think like, oh, okay, I don't know what my next step could be, and maybe I'm going to see someone else now, or like talking to Nabil or whatever. So these people more like, but I don't like other people. I don't think, yeah, they come so much, or you know,
Right.
I
Right.
think it's
Right.
more like a political thing, really.
But that's interesting that you know you've used that word quite a few times, but the political thing. It's interesting because I mean, as far as I know, Chen Yu doesn't have any formal political established kind of organization. When I say political, I mean something as in a formal organization, etc. Right? It's the same with my teacher. There's no such thing. I mean, where is the
Yeah.
political issue coming in from? Is it because of the establishment of such a large, you know, set organization as, for example, the Chen Shaowang organization, etc., etc.?
I think it's like when people come together, I think it's the same in humankind everywhere. You know, like they form some sort of organizations, and
A tribe.
um, a tribe, yeah. And
Yeah.
at some point, the tribe, you know, the tribe is like at some when you have 12 people, it's still kind of tribal. But then at some point, when it grows, the tribe has to be organized in a different way. So and then, of course, bigger organizations come around. So they form hierarchies or whatever. And I think then and hierarchies just have they're usually based on truth, what is right and what is wrong. So if the people at the top say this is right and this is wrong, so then people will kind of usually take that as a given, because
Right.
competence is also spread out more to the top. So I think if you have that sort of organization, and that's what we quite often have in Chinese derived sort of organizations in the West, I think, then I think they become a bit more closed. And I'm not saying it's necessarily always bad. It has positive aspects and bad aspects, I think. And like I think I use the term because quite often people, when you say something technical, people might take it as that it is something political.
Yes,
And so
that's what I found. I found that too.
Or you're saying like, oh, this is a technique which I would use, and then people say, oh, you're bad-mouthing someone, you're disrespecting that person. So it's more like suddenly people interpret it as being personal, So I'm
Right.
just trying to be clear about what I'm basically trying to say, and that people shouldn't necessarily take it as something else. But of course, it's not in my control anymore. But I think, like we could talk much more technically about a lot of these arts and practices. And unfortunately, this is not so often done, is it?
Yeah.
Like, so.
It's quite interesting. I mean, it's various forms of this type of prejudice. It's yeah, as you said, sometimes it is because there are some positives to it, but you'd wish that martial arts would be a way for somebody to liberate his mind as well as his body, but at least his mind, so he can have some sort of ability to think for himself. I mean, if we're not using these skills to become stronger, independent people, then I don't know. In my personal opinion, then the teacher has failed. But you sometimes see the opposite. They become less independent in the way they think. And even if they agree with the words coming out of your mouth and they see the point, simply because of, well, you can call it politics or tribal aspects related to Chinese martial arts groups, they refuse to admit it. They don't have to admit it to you. Sure, okay, you don't have to. But to themselves, and for me, that's like, now you're regressing, It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think the only thing we can do is like take a look at the social structures also. I think if we pretend they're not there, then we can't work with them.
Yeah.
But we will always, when we meet up, we will always have a certain like social structure,
Yeah.
So I think it comes a bit also to the aspect that like we have a lot of like in Taiji Chuan, like the hippie-esque more organizations, in the West. And so but then some of them also have a bit like a guru figure at the top. So it's a bit like a mix between like hippie-esque organizations where everybody's the same, we're all on eye level and so on. And then some person who's like the guru. So
the chosen one.
Like a pyramid. Yeah, the chosen one. So, and then these organizations, for example, they always have an issue with someone who's like in the middle, like someone who's making progress, because they're always like, oh no, we are all on one level. You shouldn't be the teacher, shouldn't be on on eye level with the teacher, So they don't like progress actually, because they always think, okay, there's one guru and he knows it all, and the rest of us, we are all sheep.
The same, yeah.
Yeah, we all, and you should always be a sheep. You shouldn't change, So I think if we look at these structures, then we can kind of change it and think, okay, does it make sense? To me, it doesn't make sense, because when you're practicing an art or when you're teaching it, you want to see progress. I mean, you want your students at some point, skill-wise, to be a challenge. Not necessarily in a social way that they're like, I don't know, you're becoming foes, but I mean, like skill-wise, they should become a challenge to you. Otherwise, you're not a good teacher, I think.
Well, I mean, I remember one of the few things my teacher, early early on in my training said to me, he's like, there's aspects in my training that I learned himself, that he learned from his teacher, that he surpassed his teacher. And he will teach me everything, and he wants me to surpass him. And I should hand this down, and the next generation should surpass me. You know, that's always been his desire. And that's a healthy attitude. I mean, I think in that way, a lineage and a style improves after every generation. But if you're thinking that there's a guru and the next generation cannot possibly get to his level, so then the next generation after that doesn't get to their level, 3 generations down, you're declining. You're not improving. I don't know if they've thought this through properly, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a wrong kind of respect. You know, to respect your teacher, I think, is to try and surpass him. If you manage or not, it doesn't really matter. But not even trying means you're not showing the respect to what he teaches.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, he's teaching, but oh no, I won't reach you anyway. So I think it's wrong. Chen Yu said the same. Like I remember he was at a Baishe ceremony. There was a new student, a disciple. So Chen Yu was saying like, and in the future, I want you to surpass me. Because then the next generation will have the skill, you know. I think that's the proper respect. It doesn't mean if you ever achieve to surpass your teacher, then you're looking down on him.
Well, exactly.
That would be wrong again. So
exactly. Well, you've just had your summer training camp, yes?
Yeah, we're doing it annually. Yeah.
And what is that like, and how was it this year?
Yeah, it's a great camp. It's not even my fault. I can't do anything about it. No, it's just like we meet in the middle of nowhere in central Germany, go to a castle, and this is a camp I founded with my kung fu brother Konstantin. And just so we thought, oh, it's great if our training groups kind of meet up, you know. And now we were like, I think almost 40 people, so it's really grown over the years and also survived the Corona years. And it's great. The whole day is just practice, you know. And we do everything like weapons, push hands. People can choose a bit what they want to do. And in the evening, people sit around a bonfire, have a beer. You know, it's a very casual sort of camp, but very intense training. It's really
very
lovely.
good.
Yeah.
I mean, those are ideal moments, and I'm sure the people that participate are going to look back in their coming years with fondness about those moments. And I think as generations come, as we go down the line of time, I think these types of activities are becoming fewer. It's not something that's quite normal with the younger generation today. They have a totally different mode of life. So yeah, it's great that you do that, and I think it's something that's worthwhile for people. I mean, if they're practicing with you or interested in practicing with you, they can contact you and possibly be a part of all of these things. But I think it's great. I think those little things, they all add up. They all make the journey more worthwhile.
Yeah, I think I'm very happy that usually I'd say we have a very healthy community, you know, of really good people, and who are just interested in the arts and who just want to progress. And everybody's different, you know. So like we have young people, old people, and still some people more training more seriously. Some people maybe don't have so much time at the moment or whatever. So, but I think it's really healthy for a group to be diverse, and so yeah, people get together, and because we have social aspects in the martial arts. I mean, you mentioned earlier, like we want to individually progress, and of course that's the internal aspect, and I think just like you, when you speak of your teacher and how you teach, also like you live in a social context. So, and if the social context is really, really bad, then it will kind of reflect on your training, of course, too.
Yeah.
So people will become aggressive or frustrated or whatever. We can also see that in some martial arts. So I think to have a healthy community and so everybody can progress, that's always been a bit of my dream, and I hope we can manage well. I mean, I don't know what will happen in the future, but I think we've managed so far. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. I mean, I could talk to you for hours. We got quite a bit of your background, and we spoke about some topics related to ideas, concepts, meaning of training. Maybe in the future we can do this again, and we can focus on some specific topics related to your practices of Chen style in more specific terms. But I think it's been quite an interesting discussion for the people to hear. And thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for your time, and thanks for inviting me. And I also thought, like, sometimes in this, when we talk, I thought like I would ask you some questions too.
Oh, you can.
Maybe we can also at some point just talk about some concepts which our arts share, and where maybe they differ. So maybe that also might be interesting for listeners to listen to.
Yeah, well, we can set something up in the future. With technology, these things are easy to do now. So yeah, I look forward to that. I will get whatever contact details, etc., you want shared with the public, and then I'll put them in the show description, etc. So people that are looking to contact you, to study with you, etc., they can find you. So we'll put that in that there. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great, and we'll chat again soon.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.